Joining us tonight is Gordan Chang, columnist, author, senior fellow at the Gatestone Institute. Gordan, it is good to see you, and thanks for joining us. This propaganda campaign by China, the Communist Party concocting what I said is a silly claim that the U.S. armies dropped some viruses in Wuhan. That is so on its face ridiculous. How is it that they are suddenly resorting to absurd claims, things that they know will have absolutely no credulity with Americans or anyone else reasonable?
Yeah, I think what's happening, Lou, is that the Communist Party is very sensitive about its secrecy, that it covered up the virus. You know, the Chinese people have really been calling for fundamental political change, and they've been doing it openly on China's social media platforms. You talked about the death of Dr. Li, one of the Wuhan 8. That actually ignited the Chinese population against the party. So really what the party is trying to do is to find an enemy, and that enemy is the United States. They've come up with these dangerous claims that the U.S. Army spread this to Wuhan. And so essentially what we've got ourselves into is essentially a situation where the party is unrelenting hostility against the United States.
Well, that unrelenting hostility, I think we also have to acknowledge that I've witnessed it myself. Among the physicians we're talking with, the researchers, and also government officials who are working with the Chinese on the Wuhan virus, they've had, it seems to me, very good communication and very good cooperation, even sharing ideas from the Chinese with our doctors and researchers.
Yes, I mean, on a doctor-to-doctor basis, I mean, there is good cooperation. The problem is the political system in China has identified the U.S. as an enemy. And that's why I think it's very important for President Trump to make it clear that this virus came from China. As Confucius said, the most important thing is the rectification of names. This virus came from China. It's a virus, so the president's term is absolutely in order. And I'm a Chinese American, of course. I don't see any racism in what President Trump is trying to do. What I see is a president who's defending the United States of America against a dangerous, hostile communist regime.
Yeah, and it seems it's intent on becoming more so. Do you think this has reached a point where it's endangering the historic trade deal the president put together with Xi Jinping?
Yes, I mean, the Global Times, which is run by the Communist Party's People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China, has been intimating this last 3 or 4 days that China will not go forward with the Phase 1 trade deal because it can't honor its $200 billion commitment. Also, Lou, in the last 2 days, yesterday, China attacked the dollar in a very rhetorical piece in Global Times.
Right.
Today, they're suggesting the world is going into a depression because of the U.S. So they're now trying to collapse the American economy.
You know, it's really quite interesting that the Chinese would hold forth with such claptrap, saying that the United States built modern China, and with eyes wide open, at least on the part of corporate America and Wall Street, and some of the accommodating politicians of both the Republican and Democratic parties. Your thoughts right now about the expulsion of those journalists by the Chinese, the Communist Party making it very clear that they are not going to tolerate openness, transparency, and American journalists.
Yeah, what the party is trying to do is a number of things, including the origin of this virus. And so it doesn't want journalists, foreign journalists in China. And therefore, we've seen the second round of expulsion of American journalists. You know, there's so many Chinese journalists in the U.S., Lou, many more than Americans in China. And we know that the Chinese journalists here are actually part of the Ministry of State Security. They're essentially spies. The U.S. has to do something about this, and I'm very glad that the Secretary of State has taken some robust measures to protect us with regard to these quote-unquote journalists here.
It's interesting that matters seem to be going into the ditch between China and the United States when it was so promising. And their insistence that they elude responsibility for being the origin of this virus well, to me, it is not surprising, but it is disappointing. And further, we all know who have to deal with disinformation as well as information and know the difference, that once you control language, as the left in this country is attempting to do, even resorting to aligning themselves with the communist Chinese leadership in trying to create a sense that this is somehow racist, to call this the China virus when we call Lyme disease, named after a place, when we talk about Zika, it just goes, Ebola, you name it. Naming flus and viruses after places is quite common.
Well, it's especially important after China tried to say this is an American disease, because what Beijing is doing is justifying in its own minds the use of force against the U.S. and preparing the Chinese people for that. So it's very important for President Trump to push back on this. And so this is a matter of our being trying to deter the Chinese from some potentially dangerous conduct. Every American should be behind the president on this, because we have a common enemy and they mean us harm, Lou.
I understand, as I think you know. And I think also every American should pay attention to the news organizations that absolutely refuse to call it the Wuhan virus, the China virus, out of some sort of condescension to the nonsense that to do so would be racist. This is an extraordinary, to me, kowtowing to specious nonsense by the propaganda of a communist state. Of course, also aligned with, in this instance, the American left wing. Gordan Chang, as always, good to see you.
Thanks, Lou.
And breaking news now, immigration